The most damning thing I can say about South of Midnight, which I'm not sure I've actually felt this way about many games, is that the best parts of the experience do not benefit from it being a video game. If you simply watched the cutscenes on YouTube, you would have experienced basically 90% of what I think is worthwhile here. The other 10% is a few particularly striking landscape and area shots that come up here and there. The first thing that made me raise an eyebrow when I launched this were the options within the settings to skip combat and boss battles. I've mentioned this before, but I'll repeat it here. Options like this always worry me. The charitable interpretation is that it's an accessibility feature to allow people who aren't as adept at games to simply enjoy the world and the story. But the more critical outlook on this is that it indicates that the developers themselves tested this and came to the conclusion that this aspect of the game is likely to be a deal breaker for many players. And so they offer an option to skip it so as to reduce the impact it has on player experience. This is how I felt about the option to reduce the dialogue between Frey and Calf in Forspoken, or the option to reduce how much dialogue the guns have in High on Life. Hell, even Dustborn had the option to reduce the amount of dreadful banter that Pax has in combat. Many of the supermassive horror games have the options to remove the quick-time reaction elements from the experience. These aspects of these games were all the type that can end up being a deal breaker due to how exhausting or irritating they can be. And I can say that the gameplay and especially the combat of South of Midnight falls into that category. At the core, this is a 3D platformer game with arena combat sections. As I've already indicated, I really did not like the implementation of the latter here. With a single weapon set, repetitive enemy encounters and designs, a very limited upgrade tree with very few options, most of which do not add anything interesting and merely increase the power and duration of previous upgrades in the chain. By the time I got to the first major boss of the game, a giant alligator called Two-Toed Tom, I was about ready to quit this game. Only lowering the difficulty from normal to easy allowed me to play the rest of it. This was not because it was tough, I was yet to die a single time up to that point, but it was because the experience of the combat was so dreadful that I genuinely did not want to engage in another fight. The combat sections, always quartered off in clearly marked areas, go on for so long due to the increased health coupled with repetitive mechanics. The only enemy type I found interesting or impactful was one who shields other enemies, as they required priority whenever you see one of their tethers linked to other enemies, as it can end up prolonging the fight, which for me was my biggest worry, not the actual difficulty. There is also sometimes this weird delay where you clear one wave of enemies and the game sort of just stalls, like it's trying to load in the next set. It's weird because the enemies are super basic and there aren't many options, so it just feels like my time is being wasted. I assume it's some kind of engine limitation. At least on easy difficulty, the fights would go over very fast and I could just move on to the next one. At this point, it began to become clear to me why that option to skip the combat was provided. Looking at the global Steam achievement charts as a point of reference, it appears this experience may not be unique to myself, as it seems to be at that point that most players drop off this game. Regarding the platforming, it's serviceable. It's certainly the part I enjoyed more, and is also the core reason I was interested in the title to begin with. We don't get many 3D platformers these days, and I think the last decent attempt was A Hat in Time. Unfortunately, there isn't really anything in the way of worthwhile secrets off the beaten path, even though the game hints that there should be. The more interesting sections often offer ways to acquire more of the game's skill point resource, and that's basically it, where you look for a way to get to a node that is in the distance and then you undergo a light platforming challenge to get to it. But when this only feeds into a skill tree that is completely uninteresting to then feed into an underwhelming combat system, it rarely feels worth it. I feel like this desperately needed either more weapons for Hazel or costumes or something else to unlock that makes these small detours worth it. Now, with all that being said, it seems clear that the goal from the dev team here was to deliver more of the story and characters, given how the gameplay almost feels like it's there out of obligation. This is what inspired the title of my video. So, how is South of Midnight as more of a visual audio experience? I think it's going to depend on one's response and appetite for the chosen material here. The game is set in the deep south of America, the Bayou, and follows newly awakened spirit weaver Hazel, on a quest to save her mom, who is lost when their house is swept downriver during a hurricane. On this journey, she comes into contact with various characters, learns about the spirit world, its past, and what this new role of hers requires her to do, which is basically to encounter and heal the trauma that spirits faced in life and help them to aid them in moving on. Essentially, she helps heal trauma such that spirits can move on. In concept, this idea is very solid, and the voice acting and fantastic music definitely do a lot to carry it. But I feel like this area does have issues as well. For one, this game is really short. This isn't a problem in and of itself, but I feel like it affected a good amount of the potential effectiveness of this narrative. Characters are introduced completely out of nowhere and then dropped out of the narrative almost as quickly as they arrived. At one point in the game, a character called Laurent is introduced that has not been mentioned a single time before this point. Suddenly, he is the major focus of all the dialogue. Then you meet him, he immediately changes into an all-monster after a short argument with Hazel. And by the way, the concept of this type of transformation is also introduced shortly before this point. You chase him down, fight him in a boss battle, heal him, he returns to his senses, they have a bit of a talk, and then he helps transport Hazel to the next area, and just like that, he's gone. He's mentioned in passing once after this, and then name drop in the epilogue. And he is one of the better treated characters. In the second major area, a preacher named Prosper, I forget her actual name, is shown on a billboard as the area starts. Later, she turns out to be linked to the trauma of that particular area. You uncover some very tragic information about her past, but there is no discussion with her about it at all. It's not explored in any way. You're simply told what it is, and then you move on to the next section. She never appears again and is not mentioned a single time after that. She herself does not even encounter that. She never even realizes that Hazel knows her secrets or anything. She's just gone. This applies to basically all the major story beats of the game. They simply tell you that something bad happened to someone. Hazel makes a single comment each time, bottles up the trauma in these spirit bottles she carries, and then there is this running section where you run from a monster called Kushma, which I appreciated, if I'm honest. Even though it's repetitive, it takes me back to the time when these kind of sections were more mainstream in games. And then she arrives at a spirit tree, and the plot continues on from the next section after that. The idea of exploring trauma and secrets was done way better in last year's Banishers Ghosts of New Eden by Dontnod Studios. And if you're someone that enjoys that particular aspect of the experience, I would recommend that game instead, as it has a much more mature take on the material and actually tries to explore these lingering traumas a lot more than simply telling you what happened and expecting you to care on principle. The core characters in that game are introduced early on, and then their connection to the overall mystery and storyline is interwoven through multiple side quests, in addition to returning many times throughout the game, right till the final confrontation before the game ends. My final criticism is the tone. This is another one of those titles that falls into the middle valley, where it seems to be too childish for adults, but it's also definitely too edgy for kids. For some reason, they decided Hazel needs to curse a lot. So it generally fluctuates between trying to be cute and also indulging in a lot more mature material, which I often find jarring, but it seems to be a popular approach among writers these days. In conclusion, despite an ambitious concept and setting, this project fumbles in its execution. The bare bones gameplay makes it a pain to play, and if you're interested in the narrative, I would say Banishers Ghosts of New Eden did this concept a lot better last year. So you're basically getting the inferior Disney-fied version of that. I would recommend this for the music only, since that is genuinely well done, but that can easily be experienced without having to put up with the gameplay, which unfortunately is meant to be the core part of a game. Some people tend to forget that. I really think this would have been better served by just being an animated movie for kids, perhaps in the vein of something like Paranorman or one of those types of movies, The Corpse Bride, though they would probably have to tone down on the swearing in order to make that work. And that's my thoughts on South of Midnight. I'm trying to keep this one short.